All right, good morning once again. Good to see everybody here. If you'll turn to John chapter 11, we'll be picking up in our study in the Gospel of John there in chapter 11. And we'll be picking up in verse 18 in a moment. Now, last week we saw Jesus in a situation where he had received a message that a friend whom he dearly loved was sick, Lazarus. And they want him, of course, to come and to heal Lazarus, but Jesus remains where he is for 2 days. And by the time he is able to make it to Lazarus, he had already been dead for 4 days. And so we kind of investigated that and kind of considered some questions that we oftentimes ask when we encounter tragedy or hardship, things that boggle our minds. And we saw that a lot of times we question, does God know? Does God care? If he does, why doesn't he act right away? And, who's really in control? Am I just up to my circumstances? Is it all random chance that everything happens? These are typical questions that we ask. And we found in the early part of chapter 11 that, no, Jesus does know. He knew this situation. He even knew how the situation would turn out. He definitely cared. He said that he loved Mary and her sister Martha and Lazarus. We saw also that he does things in his own time, even if it doesn't fit in our time frame. And he definitely was in control. He specifically said that this situation wasn't going to end in death, that he was going to go and wake him out of sleep. And so we saw these things last week, and we'll see a lot of these things also kind of develop as we continue in the chapter, because it's not that Jesus just demonstrated these things at the beginning before he went to Bethany to see about Mary and Martha, but all throughout the story. But we'll pick up where we left off in we'll overlap here in verse 17 just to keep the context. It says, "So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb for 4 days." As we mentioned before, this meant that this in the Jewish mind was a hopeless situation. Not only had Jesus not come before Lazarus had died, but he came 4 days after he had died. And in the Jewish mind, there was maybe a possibility of resuscitation, up to 3 days. They felt like the soul kind of hovered over the body for 3 days, but on the 4th day, then there was no chance really to be resurrected. So this seemed very, very hopeless. We'll find out later that Lazarus is already letting off a stench, which indicates that he's already decomposing, which again makes this seem as though a hopeless situation. And so Jesus had delayed coming. As a result, Lazarus lays in the tomb for 4 days. And we have to ask ourselves, are there times and situations that we have come to the Lord and prayed about a particular situation, and all of our hopes of the situation being redeemed, being fixed, being sorted out, lay in the tomb? Maybe lay in the tomb metaphorically for 4 days. We just feel like there is no more hope. We went to the Lord in prayer. He apparently didn't answer our prayer, and now all is lost. Is that the end of the story whenever we encounter those situations? We'll find that, no, it's not the end of the story, as we'll see as we continue. It says in verse 18, "Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off." And that's definitely true. It was east of Jerusalem, on the other side of the Mount of Olives. And so this is in close proximity that would allow a lot of people from Jerusalem to come and visit Mary and Martha, as we see in the following verse. In verse 19, "And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother." Which tells us a little bit about Mary and Martha. It shows that they were influential not only in the small little community of Bethany, but they seem to even have some connections in Jerusalem, which would make this miracle that's about to take place all the more popular. Would have been passed around all the much more as people would have witnessed this, but also known the people involved in it. It would have caused the news about this to spread fairly quickly, especially in the region around Jerusalem. It says in verse 20, "Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house." Now, we don't want to read too much into this, And I only offer this as suggestion, not as this is how it is. But could it be that these are the two different responses by Martha and Mary? For one, we could go maybe just purely on personality, right? Martha seems to be, as we read about them in other places, Martha seems to be the busy one. She seems to be the one always active. She seems to be the one that is the first to go and do things. And it might have just been the difference in personalities between her and Mary. Mary seems to be the more introverted type individual. But it could also be that maybe each of these women responded to the situation in a different way. Martha, we're going to see in a moment, stands on faith. She's grounded in faith. She's going to demonstrate tremendous faith in Jesus, even in this dire situation. But Mary, we don't have quite that much information about whether she was really challenged by this whole situation or whether she too was standing on faith. It doesn't give us really a whole lot of information to go on. So it could be that Martha is going because she's going in faith. She knows that the situation isn't over yet because Jesus has come and she's going out to meet him. But Mary might be a little bit more despondent, a little bit more discouraged, and therefore she hangs back. Again, the text doesn't tell us, but these are some, at least, possibilities that we can play with as we consider this story, which will become significant in a moment. And she says in verse 21, Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. And there's two ways to consider this first statement that she makes. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. One could have been her almost accusative of Jesus, saying, Lord, you didn't get here quick enough. You should have gotten here before he died. You could have healed him, just like we've seen you heal thousands of other people. You didn't get here quick enough. The second way is to say, no, she's just stating a fact. This might even be a statement of faith. Lord, I know that you have the power to heal. And I know had you been here, you wouldn't have allowed him to die. She could be just stating, again, a fact. This is the fact. Had he been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. But what shows us that she actually is stepping out in faith is that second statement that we read, where she said, even now, verse 22, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. To everyone else, this was a hopeless situation. Dead, and not only dead, good and dead for 4 days, already stinking, already decomposing. But she still has this statement of faith saying, Lord, with you, the story is not over yet. We know that you can still work something out in this situation. And what a profound approach to things that not only Martha has, but that we could have as well. Maybe all of our hopes and dreams and maybe hopes for being rescued or being delivered or whatever it is might lay in the tomb for 4 days, as we mentioned before. And we have a choice to make. We know, if the Lord had come early in the situation, he could have fixed the situation, everything would have been fine, and we would have just continued on as things were. But sometimes situations become more and more dire, more and more bleak, to the point to where we think all hope is lost. It almost seems very clear, the Lord's not going to help me in this situation. There's nothing he's going to do anymore. And the question is how will we respond in those situations? I think a good demonstration of faith is to say, Lord, the situation already seems impossible. We already seem to be past that point of where, in all probability, this situation will be redeemed, will be sorted out. But Lord, I know even now you can work in this situation. Even now I know that you can work something good in this situation. And this could be whether it was 4 days after we needed that answered prayer, or it could be 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the road where we came to the Lord in prayer and he seems to not have answered our prayer. But then looking back, we realize, he was working something. He was working something very mightily and very powerfully in this situation that I wasn't aware of. And then we can see that he definitely wasn't done and through with the situation. We deal with a Christ who is a redeeming Christ. He redeems these situations. He can work in these situations and bring about good even in the most dire situations. In verse 23, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Right. Plain statement, very general statement. He will rise again. That could mean a lot of different things. For her, she took that as meaning on the day of resurrection, of the general resurrection, which many of the Jewish people had already come to believe in. She says in verse 24, Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. I'm familiar with the scriptures, at least what the scriptures taught, going back to Daniel, where Daniel talks about the last day, the resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous, that sort of thing. Yeah, I know in the far future, there will be resurrection. In the far future, there will be redemption and a return of things in the right, proper way. But look how Jesus responds in verse 25. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And if anyone who lives and believes in me, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die, do you believe this? So Jesus is giving her a profound truth, saying that resurrection isn't just a day. When we think about the resurrection, we think of a day, the day of resurrection, the day of judgment, the day of the issuing in of the new heavens and the new earth. We think of a day. What Jesus is saying, resurrection isn't just a day, it's a person. And I am that person. I am the resurrection. If you're connected to me, there's always a possibility for resurrection. And of course, all of us can say, yes, we have come to know that. We all know that we ourselves were dead in our trespasses and sins, Ephesians chapter 2, but we've been made alive together with Christ. We have found resurrection power by being connected to the person who is resurrection. And so spiritually, we have already seen this to be true. And because we have seen this to be true and have experienced this to be true spiritually, we all the more look forward to the day when this will be true physically and actually on that last day. And we'll talk about that more later on in the story, but it's important for all believers to understand that the resurrection isn't just a day, it's a person. And we need to stay in contact with that person all the time. In verse 27, she said to him, Yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. Think about this great statement of faith. She basically is confessing three things about Jesus. He's the Christ. He's the one who is anointed by God, which means he's the one appointed by God. He's also the Son of God, which alludes to his deity and being connection to God in his essence. And then she's also believing him to be the one who was coming into the world. That is the fulfillment of prophecy. All those prophecies that happened over the span of some 1,500 years, and maybe even further back than that if you go to verbal communication that went on. This prophecy that people were looking forward to, a person who was going to come and fix everything that was broken. She believed that about Jesus. This Martha, who just witnessed her brother, whom she loved dearly, die and be placed in a tomb in grave clothes. This Martha, who knew Jesus loved Lazarus but didn't come to his rescue. Even in the midst of not understanding all the ins and outs and having all of her questions answered, she stood on what she knew to be true. She knew, one, the situation wasn't over yet, and two, she knew that even if I don't understand what Jesus is working in this situation, I know that he is the Christ, he is the Son of God, and he is the one coming into the world. He is the fulfillment of Scripture, and therefore I can stand on that truth. And as we talked about before in previous studies, we've seen that when we have these questions, when things come into our lives that completely pull the rug out from under our feet, and we just completely are at a loss at how this could happen, this tragedy, how could God allow this to happen in my life? One of the most comforting things and one of the most important things when you have a whole lot of questions is to fall back on, okay, I have all these questions, but what about what do I know? What have I come to know about Jesus thus far? I may not understand this part, but this is what I do know. Martha probably didn't understand exactly what Jesus was going to do in this situation. She knew that the situation wasn't completely done because Jesus was present, but she did have some things that she very much did believe about him. The Christ, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. Sometimes we just got to fall back on what we do know in those seasons where we are completely in chaos and confusion and we don't understand how everything is going to play out. Very important for us to understand. In verse 28, When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, "The teacher is here and calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Two different responses by two different women. Jesus comes in close proximity to Bethany. Martha goes out and meets him. Mary hangs back. Again, we don't know exactly why. Maybe she's a little discouraged, a little depressed, maybe whatever. But two different responses. But in both situations, there was a need. No matter how they initially responded, there was a need for both of these women. And that was to come to Jesus. Martha needed to come to Jesus. She did it of her own initiative. Mary needed to go to Jesus. She did it by Martha's encouragement. But nonetheless, both of them needed to come to Jesus. And that's what we need to remember when we don't understand our situations. When we don't understand why God's working a certain way in a particular situation, we might want to hang back. We might want to fully embrace Christ. We might respond to that. We might be angry. We might be sorrowful. We might be confused. We might be left depressed or whatever, anxious, fearful, whatever our response is to that situation. In all situations and in all responses, we need to come to Jesus. All of us have a different psychological makeup. All of us deal with situations differently, right? Some people can just blaze through hardships and it's like it's nothing. Others can barely crawl through hardships. All of us respond different to hard situations, just psychologically speaking. But no matter any of those variables, no matter what they may be, we all need to come to Jesus in hard times. He's the only one who can comfort us. He's the only one who can give us peace. He's the only one who can give us assurance when everything else is not so sure. A tendency when we meet tragedy is to push Jesus away. And when we do that, we're pushing ourselves away from the only one who can help us in the tragedy. And that becomes an even more dire situation. Come to Jesus, whether you're Martha, whether you're Mary, whether you understand, whether you're standing on faith or you're questioning and doubting, come to Jesus and see if you're not at least comforted and brought peace that goes beyond all comprehension and all understanding. In verse 30, now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary had got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Once again, we have Jesus delaying. And every time we see him delaying, it's for a purpose, for a reason. We see him delaying with Lazarus because here he's going to display the glory of the Son of God. Now he's delaying perhaps to draw out this crowd, maybe to bring this out into a more public situation. Maybe if he had just gone to Mary, they may have just hung back and said, well, Jesus wants to speak with Mary. Let's give them their privacy or something like that. But the fact that Mary came up and they didn't really know what she was doing and that brought a whole crowd now allows for the glory of the Son of Man to not only be displayed within his little circle of friends, but publicly before all of the people, even these people who had come from Jerusalem. So he's delaying, not going into the village, perhaps so that this can be all the more a demonstration of who he is to more people. In verse 32, therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Notice that it doesn't follow up with any statements of faith, and that's what I was referring to earlier. With Martha, it was followed up with, yet even now, Lord, I know that you can work in this situation. I know that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. But with Mary, that's all we're given. So we're left questioning, is she challenged by this situation maybe a little bit more than Martha was? But nonetheless, both of them came to Jesus, and both of them saw a mighty work of God because they came to Jesus. And you just can't imagine or comprehend what you might see God do in your situation if you'll just hold fast and come to him and not give up. When we give up, we're cutting ourselves off from seeing some mighty acts of God in our situation, whether it's in fixing the situation or in bringing us that comfort and peace that only he can provide. Whatever it is that he's going to work out in the situation, we can only really truly see it if we cling fast to him and hold fast to him. It says in verse 33, when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. So she's coming along, or she had already came along, fell at his feet, said, Lord, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. And then the people that were there with her are weeping. She's weeping. And it says that he was deeply moved. Now that word in the Greek, I'm told, is a very difficult phrase to translate. It basically just means to be really stirred up emotionally, to have strong emotions about something. In every other place in the New Testament, and even in the Septuagint in the Old Testament, that phrase is used to talk about someone becoming indignant or becoming angry. Their emotions are stirred up and they become angry. And some have suggested that maybe that's Jesus' response. As he sees Mary weeping, he sees the people around her weeping, that he becomes very angry, deeply moved. His emotions are stirred up in a very angered way. That would still fit this whole scenario, because Jesus, seeing the disaster of sin, what the disaster that sin has left, what the rule of Satan has ruined, seeing people perplexed, distraught, weeping over this reality of death that they're confronted with, he would become very angry at that. It also fits if you just see him as being deeply moved emotionally in a sad way, or in a compassionate way. That would definitely fit. Of course, Jesus saw them with compassion, as we'll see in a moment. But nonetheless, Jesus was emotionally moved by the situation, even though he knew how it was going to end up. And again, we'll mention that in a minute. He says he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. And in verse 34, and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." So remember, he's still outside the village. Now they're going to go to the tomb where Lazarus was laid. And then verse 35, the shortest verse in all Scripture. You can't get a shorter sentence than this. One noun, one verb. Jesus wept. And if you're like me as a kid, if you were challenged by an adult, or maybe just among your peers, memorize a verse for the week. Well, this is the one you'd go to. Because, yeah, Jesus wept. I've memorized that verse. Very easy to memorize. It's very short. Not hard to remember at all. 2 words. But very profound. Don't let the simplicity of the sentence make you miss the profundity of the thought and the idea behind this statement. Jesus. Who is Jesus? The Creator, the one through whom all things were created. Nothing was made that was made except through him, we were told in chapter 1. This is the Creator of all things. God in his power worked through his Son, Jesus Christ, in creating everything that we see. This is the one who is called in Revelation the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who's riding on the white horse. This is the one that we're told in Philippians chapter 3 is the one in whom every knee will bow and every tongue confess that he is Lord. This is the Jesus who's given all authority and power. This is the Jesus who is God manifested in the flesh, who is the express image of the Father, as we're told in the book of Hebrews. This is the glorious, powerful, majestic Jesus Christ. But it's that second word that brings comfort. Maybe you see Jesus as this high and lofty individual, this person who is way above us, who has wisdom and knowledge beyond our comprehension, who has power beyond anything that we can understand. But don't forget this second part. That one that you look up to and see so transcendent above everything is also the one who condescends and weeps among us. Jesus shed tears in this situation. And this word for weep is different than the word used previously. In the weeping with Mary and those who came from Jerusalem, it's more like a crying out, like a loud wailing crying. Here, the word weep just means to shed tears. So Jesus is standing there before the tomb, and he's just very calmly and serenely shedding tears from his eyes. And which is amazing. Because think about it. He knows what's going to happen. He knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He already said he was going to do it. Even before he came to Bethany, he said that this wasn't going to end in death. He's asleep. I've gone so that I might awaken him. And yet he's still shedding the tears. Maybe sometimes we think, because God is all-knowing, because he is omniscient, all-knowing. He understands the situation because he has a plan, because he has a purpose, because we know he's working out all things for good. And maybe we see God as kind of this stoic individual in heaven who says, yes, let me check my my clipboard, and yes, this is all going according to my plan. And he doesn't really feel any emotions. He doesn't have any compassion stirred up towards us because he knows how it's all going to end. Don't think that for a moment. This story shows us that even though God knows that things are going to work out in the end, in redemption and in glory, he still weeps. He still is stirred up emotionally for us. Whether stirred up in anger, as we saw earlier, possibly, or stirred up with compassion and sadness over the situation. When God looks over all the world and he sees the suffering, the hardship, he sees babies crying out because there's nothing to eat. He sees all the natural disasters that take place. He sees evil individuals taking advantage of innocent people. He's going to work good through all of that, ultimately, but that doesn't mean he's not still stirred up about it. That he doesn't perhaps, at least metaphorically, shed some tears. Remember when you are brought to your knees, when the situation is bleak and dire and it seems like all hope is lost, there is a God who's watching your situation and his compassions are stirred up for you, even if he knows something good is going to come out of it. A father, or we could say a mother too, who sees their child hurting, maybe at the dentist, they take them to the dentist and they know it's for their good that they have to get their tooth fixed. They know the end result is going to be good. They're going to have better teeth. They're going to be have a healthier teeth. But that doesn't mean their compassions aren't stirred up while the child is sitting in the dentist chair. Doesn't mean that they don't still perhaps shed tears over the hurting child that they see right before them. And I would say that God has that same heart for us. And then verse 36, so the Jews were saying, see how he loved him. The love of Christ is not just a statement. We saw that previously, right? The one whom you love is sick. That was the message that Jesus received. John himself, the Apostle John, who wrote this epistle, this gospel, said himself, this is Martha, whom he loved, her sister, Mary, and Martha, and Lazarus, whom he loved. He'd already stated that he loved these individuals, and those were statements and facts of truth. But here we see it demonstrated through his compassion for this whole situation. His compassion for the family of Lazarus, compassion over his friend that he sees now laying in the tomb. His love now is demonstrated. And we should remember that. When we read statements like God is love, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, those aren't just statements. Those aren't just truth claims. That's what it is in reality, in actuality. He really loves us, and he demonstrates his love time and time again in our lives, even in the hardships and trials. In verse 37, but some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying? It's interesting how a group of people can all see the same event. They all saw Jesus weeping and come away with totally different conclusions. Isn't that interesting? Don't we see that in life? People, maybe something happens. I mean, how many different reactions were there to 9/11 and other tragedies that we've seen in America today? And it's interesting how different people can see the same situation but respond in different ways. And what this shows us is that situations that we encounter, that we're confronted with, always seem to bring out what's in the heart, right? Why does God allow us in certain situations? It's to draw up what's in the heart. You may not know that a person is quick-tempered. You may not know that a person gets angry easily until they're in a situation where it stirs up their anger. And it may be over something very meticulous. Situations bring out what's in the heart. That's why there's different responses. You might be perplexed as, well, if Jesus is the Son of God, why doesn't everybody believe in him? If there's evidences for Christianity, why doesn't everybody just embrace that? It seems like it would be a pretty logical thing. Well, keep in mind that when we encounter Jesus, what's in our heart is brought to the surface. And we're either going to respond positively towards him based on the condition of our heart, or we're going to respond negatively towards him based on the condition of our heart. We see it here with these people just watching Jesus weep. We'll see it later with the Jewish leaders as they're trying to make sense of this miracle that's going to take place. But it's true throughout history and even today. Verse 38, so Jesus again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave and a stone was lying against it. What does that look like? Does that sound like a description of a tomb that you can think of? That sounds a lot like Jesus' own tomb. A cave with a stone in front of it? That's exactly what Jesus is going to be buried in. Not that exact tomb, but one similar to it. And could it be that when Jesus saw that tomb, he was thinking of his own tomb? But perhaps more significant than that, the disciples, when they saw Jesus' tomb, should have remembered Lazarus' tomb. As they could remember Lazarus' tomb and how that didn't end up in death, when they looked at Jesus' tomb, they should have been reminded, hey, this situation looks kind of familiar. Maybe this situation isn't going to end in death either, just as Lazarus's didn't. But nonetheless, in verse 39, Jesus said, remove the stone. Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Right, so she's saying, no, we don't want to don't open the tomb. There's going to be this stench that's going to come out, which is a very important statement in this story, because it tells us that not only was he dead for 4 days, but he was already decaying, as we mentioned before. And Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Maybe sometimes we don't follow what the Lord is telling us because it might end in an unpleasant thing. It might be something, something like this, just a stench that might come. Have we ever questioned what Jesus is leading us to do because of some unpleasant thing that might come, even though it might be something very shallow, something very not that bad? He's saying, trust me. Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And isn't that what he might be telling us? Lord, I don't want to go into that part of town, or I don't want to try to encounter that particular situation. I don't want to go talk to that individual. That'll leave a bad taste in my mouth, or they might respond to me negatively, or something like that. And Jesus is saying, did I not tell you that if you'll just believe, you'll see the glory, you'll see me working in this situation if you'll just trust me? Even though it might leave a stench in your nose or a bad taste in your mouth, go anyways, and you'll see my glory. You'll see me working in this situation. In verse 41, so they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me. All right, so this is not just something that Jesus is doing between him and the Father. This is clearly something he wants everyone to see. This is something that he's purposely doing publicly. In the early part of his ministry, we saw him kind of hidden, right? He'd say, well, you're healed, don't tell anybody. There was a timeline that he was following, but now it's getting close to his crucifixion, and now it's time to fully let the glory shine. And so now he's being more public in this particular miracle. But nonetheless, in verse 43, it says, when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice so that everybody could hear, not because he needed to speak with a loud voice. It's not like he was speaking with a loud voice because dead people wake up when you yell at them real loud. It was so that everybody knew that he was the one in command, that he was the one that's causing this resurrection. In verse 44, the man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Now, there's been a lot of people who have kind of criticized this verse. They say, well, if Lazarus was in the tomb and if he was bound in that day and age, they would actually bind the hands and the ankles. And they say, well, even if Lazarus was resurrected, how is it that he came out of the tomb? And there's been speculation. Well, they say one thing that's been postulated by those favorable or who embrace this verse, it would say, well, he's resurrected. God resurrected him. Surely he can bring him to the front of the tomb. So it could be a miraculous thing. Others that say, well, maybe they just wrapped his legs separately where he could still walk. But that would be a little bit against the traditions of the day. But as I was thinking about it, I was like, no one's thought, or at least I haven't come across, who thought of maybe the most obvious thing. Just because your ankles are bound doesn't mean you can't move around. You can hop. And I'm not saying, maybe Lazarus hopped to the front of the tomb. I mean, sometimes it's the easy answers that scholars oftentimes miss. Anyone who's been like in a race, where you have the bag and you're hopping along, you can still move even though your legs are bound. Don't let that be a challenge to your faith, okay? That's why I mentioned that. But nonetheless, he comes forward and he tells them to unbind and let him go. So as we reflect back on this story, we can see that this story actually reflects really what we've experienced spiritually. Now that we've seen what actually happened, let's look at it from a spiritual standpoint. All of us, at some point in our lives spiritually, were in the tomb. All of us have been dead in our trespasses and sins, as Ephesians chapter 2 talks about. All of us have been bound and under the snare of Satan. Paul tells this to Timothy, as he says, someone who's teaching others needs to do it in a gentle way, and with the hopes that maybe God will save them, that they'll be set free from the snare of the devil, having been held captive to do his will. Those who have not come to Christ yet are in the tomb. They're dead in their sins. They're also bound by Satan. They're bound by sin, and they need release. But not only that, they let off somewhat of a stench. That is, sin has an unpleasant type of aspect to it. But all of this could be descriptive of the sinner before encountering Christ. And I think all of us kind of fit into that category. We were all dead. We were all bound. We were all not lifting up the aroma of the glory of God in our lives, but rather we were lifting up the aroma of sin and rebellion against God. We've all gone our own way, whether we've gone far away or just a little bit away. Isaiah 53 says, we all like sheep have gone astray. And we've all died in our trespasses and sins. But Jesus, when we encountered Jesus, we were resurrected. But notice first it was the resurrection, and then there was the unbinding. But both were important. Lazarus could have just been resurrected and they never unbound him. Then he'd have a hard time getting around. They had to unbind him so he could walk about in resurrection and fully walk in resurrection life. He needed the cloth taken off of his face so he could really see, so that he could really hear, so he could really speak. That's what we need after being resurrected by Christ spiritually. We need to have the grave clothes taken off. We need to be able to walk surely before the Lord. We need to be able to use our hands to work for the Lord. We need our mouths freely to speak the glories of God. We need our eyes to truly see his working in our lives, to hear his messages that he has for us. We too need to be released of the grave clothes. It's not just enough to be resurrected, but also to walk in resurrection and to express resurrection by being unbound by Satan and being unbound by sin. That's kind of what Romans chapter 6 is all about. Don't walk in sin so that grace may abound. You've been freed from that. You died to sin. And therefore, it is no longer to be your master. In verse 45, therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. Again, different responses to the same situation. And we are out of time, so we won't quite be able to get to the rest of this chapter. But Lord willing, we will pick up next time in verse 47. But as we look back, let's take some comfort from this chapter, what we've read so far. To know that even though things may look bleak, confusing, full of chaos and uncertainty, when we are overwhelmed and flooded with the trials and troubles of this world, we have a Jesus who can give us stability. We have a Jesus that we can come to, and our faith in him can bring us through those situations, even when they seem impossible. And help us also to remember, let us also remember that through Jesus is resurrection life. That resurrection isn't just a day, but it's a person. And let's each and every day contact Jesus as our resurrection. As each and every day we need to live out the resurrection that he has already provided through his death, burial, and resurrection. If you want to participate in that, if you want to be like Lazarus today, you know you've done some things that are wrong. You know that you haven't really been living the life that you know in your heart of hearts you should be. And you want to come to the Lord and you realize that you've been dead in your trespasses and sins, that is separated from God through your sins. And you want to have resurrection life, to have newness of life, a clean slate before him. You want to be let loose of those sins and the power of Satan that's been binding you, and you want to live for God for the rest of your life, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that Dylan has prepared.